You know someone like this. Someone whose life always seems to be falling apart, but never quite enough for them to leave the situation. A man who complains endlessly about his job, the unfair boss, the exhausting hours, the feeling that his life is slowly slipping away. Every conversation returns to the same theme. He hates it. He resents it. He feels trapped by it. But every time an opportunity appears, a new path, a different job, a chance to change something, he hesitates. He delays. He finds a reason it won't work. And somehow, he remains exactly where he is. Or maybe you know someone in relationships like this. A woman who repeatedly falls into the same emotional pattern. At first, everything seems hopeful. She meets someone new. She feels alive again. She believes this time will be different. But slowly the same story unfolds. The partner becomes distant. Communication turns tense. Small disappointments grow into familiar arguments. And eventually, the relationship collapses under the weight of the same quiet resentments. She swears she is tired of this cycle. She promises herself the next relationship will be healthier. But somehow, the next person she chooses feels strangely familiar. Not consciously, but emotionally, as if the same story is quietly repeating itself. You have seen this pattern. Someone who always seems surrounded by drama. Someone who constantly finds themselves in difficult situations. Someone who says they want peace, but whose life always seems full of conflict. At first, it looks like bad luck, unfortunate circumstances, a series of accidents. But when the same pattern repeats itself for years, sometimes decades, the explanation becomes harder to accept. Because eventually, a disturbing question begins to appear. What if these situations are not simply happening to them? What if, in some unconscious way, they are helping create them? Psychology has a name for this kind of pattern. Repetition compulsion. The strange and deeply human tendency to recreate painful situations over and over again, even when we consciously claim to want something different. Sigmund Freud was one of the first to notice it. Patients would describe painful relationships, destructive habits, emotional patterns that clearly caused them suffering, and yet they returned to them, again and again. Freud noticed something unsettling. People often do not simply experience suffering. They organize their lives around it. They become strangely loyal to the very patterns that hurt them, not because they enjoy pain, but because suffering, over time, becomes familiar. And the human mind is deeply attached to what feels familiar, even when it is destructive. You can see it everywhere. The person who sabotages their progress just as things begin to improve. The person who chooses partners who will inevitably disappoint them. The person who unconsciously creates conflict in otherwise peaceful situations. From the outside, it looks irrational. Why would anyone keep recreating the very experiences that make them miserable? But this is only the surface. Because the mind does not always seek happiness. Sometimes the mind seeks something else entirely. Predictability, identity, emotional familiarity. And this is where the real problem begins. Because over time, suffering can become part of how a person understands themselves. It becomes woven into their story, into the way they interpret the world, into the expectations they carry into every relationship, every opportunity, every decision. Without realizing it, suffering becomes psychologically useful. It explains failure. It justifies hesitation. It protects the person from facing something even more uncomfortable: responsibility. Because if the world is the problem, then the individual never has to ask a far more dangerous question. What if the pattern is coming from me? Carl Jung once observed something unsettling about human behavior. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. And this is exactly what happens in these cycles. The person believes they are unlucky. They believe they are surrounded by the wrong people. They believe life simply keeps putting them in the same painful situations. But something deeper is happening here. Because behind these repeating stories, there is often an unconscious attachment to suffering itself. And once you begin to see this pattern, you start noticing it everywhere. In relationships, in careers, in identity, even in the way people talk about themselves. But to understand why the mind clings to suffering so tightly, we first need to understand the psychological pattern behind it. And that pattern is far older and far more universal than most people realize. You have seen this person before, not just once, many times. Sometimes it is the friend who constantly finds themselves in crisis. There is always a new problem, a new conflict, a new betrayal. Every conversation begins with the same quiet exhaustion. You wouldn't believe what happened this time. And as they explain the situation, you notice something strange. The circumstances change, but the emotional pattern does not. Different job, different partner, different city. Yet the same story somehow unfolds. Another disappointment. Another moment where life feels unfair. Another situation where they feel misunderstood, mistreated, or unlucky. At first, you sympathize. Anyone would. But after years of watching the same cycle repeat, a quiet suspicion begins to appear. Why does this keep happening to them? And an even stranger question follows. Why do they seem strangely comfortable inside the chaos? Carl Jung described a psychological force that helps explain this pattern. The victim identity. Not simply a person who experiences suffering because suffering is universal, but someone whose sense of self quietly organizes around it. Suffering becomes part of how they understand who they are. The injured one. The misunderstood one. The person life has treated unfairly. And once this identity forms, something subtle begins to happen. The mind starts interpreting every experience through this lens. Small disappointments feel like confirmation. Conflicts feel like proof. Failures feel like destiny. Life becomes a story that reinforces the identity already in place. This does not happen consciously. Very few people wake up in the morning thinking, "Today I will reinforce my suffering." But the unconscious mind works through patterns, not intentions. And when a certain emotional structure becomes familiar, the psyche begins gravitating towards situations that maintain it. You can observe this pattern in relationships. Someone who repeatedly chooses emotionally unavailable partners, not because they consciously want rejection, but because emotional distance feels strangely familiar. The emotional atmosphere of their past quietly shapes the partners they feel drawn to. Or consider the person who repeatedly sabotages their own progress. Just when things begin improving, a new opportunity, a promotion, a healthy relationship, something happens. A mistake. An impulsive decision. A sudden withdrawal. From the outside, it looks like bad judgment. But psychologically, something deeper may be happening. Improvement threatens the identity the person has grown accustomed to. If life becomes stable, who are they now? If suffering disappears, what story remains? Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote something unsettling about human nature. He suggested that people often prefer a meaningful suffering over a meaningless peace. Pain that fits our identity can feel safer than happiness that challenges it. Because happiness requires something suffering does not. Responsibility, growth, uncertainty. To change the pattern would require stepping into a different version of oneself. And that is often far more frightening than continuing the cycle. This is why some people unconsciously resist the very things they claim to want. Peace, healthy relationships, personal growth. Because these things require abandoning an identity built around struggle. And identities are powerful structures. They organize how we see ourselves. They shape what we believe we deserve. They determine what kinds of lives we quietly accept. So the pattern continues, not because the person consciously chooses suffering, but because their psychological structure quietly recreates the emotional world it already understands. But this still leaves a deeper mystery. Why does the mind cling so strongly to painful patterns in the first place? Why would the psyche recreate situations that clearly produce distress? The answer lies in something even deeper than identity. Because beneath these repeating cycles, there are hidden psychological mechanisms quietly guiding behavior. Mechanisms most people never notice. Mechanisms designed not to make life better, but to make it feel emotionally familiar. And once you begin to understand these mechanisms, the cycle of suffering starts to look very different. Imagine someone who has lived most of their life in tension. Maybe they grew up in a household where emotional safety was unpredictable. One day things were calm. The next day someone was angry. Conversations could suddenly become confrontations. Love existed, but it was mixed with anxiety, mixed with uncertainty, mixed with a quiet feeling that something could go wrong at any moment. A child growing up in that environment learns something important very early, not consciously, but emotionally. This is what life feels like. Years pass. The child becomes an adult. They move away. They build a career. They form relationships. On the surface, their life may look completely different from where they started. But the emotional blueprint formed early in life does not disappear. It remains quietly embedded in the nervous system. And this blueprint shapes what feels normal. Psychologists sometimes call this emotional familiarity. The mind develops an internal map of what relationships, stress, conflict, and connection are supposed to feel like. Once this map exists, the psyche begins gravitating toward experiences that match it, even when those experiences are painful. You can see this clearly in romantic relationships. Someone who grew up around emotional distance may feel strangely uncomfortable with a partner who is consistently warm and available. At first, it seems perfect. The partner communicates clearly. They show affection. They create stability. But over time, something inside the person begins to feel restless. The relationship feels unfamiliar, almost too calm, too predictable. And without realizing it, the person may begin to withdraw emotionally, or create conflict, or lose interest. Not because the relationship is unhealthy, but because it does not match the emotional environment their mind recognizes. This pattern is not limited to relationships. It appears in work, friendships, and even personal goals. Consider someone who constantly pushes themselves into burnout. They work excessively. They fill every hour of their day. They chase productivity with relentless intensity. From the outside, it looks like ambition. But often, something else is happening. Stillness feels uncomfortable. Quiet moments bring unease. Without constant pressure, they feel strangely lost. So, they recreate the stress their mind already understands. The suffering becomes structured, organized, predictable. And in that predictability, the nervous system finds a strange kind of stability. Carl Jung described something similar when he spoke about the shadow. Parts of our psychological life remain outside conscious awareness. They influence behavior without announcing themselves. They shape our choices quietly, behind the scenes. And one of the shadow's most subtle strategies is this. It disguises familiar suffering as destiny. The person believes life simply keeps placing them in difficult situations. But often the psyche is unconsciously navigating toward environments that confirm its internal expectations. Because there is something the mind fears more than suffering: the unknown. Psychologically speaking, the brain prefers a familiar pain over an unfamiliar peace. Because familiar pain can be predicted. It can be managed. It fits the emotional model already stored inside the psyche. Unfamiliar peace, on the other hand, requires adaptation. It requires new emotional skills, new ways of relating, new ways of understanding oneself. And that uncertainty can feel deeply threatening. This is why people sometimes sabotage their own progress. Not because they want to fail, but because success moves them into unfamiliar psychological territory. A healthier relationship may require vulnerability they have never practiced. A new career path may challenge the identity they have carried for years. A stable life may remove the chaos they unconsciously use to explain themselves. So the psyche pulls them back toward what it already knows, back toward the emotional environment that feels recognizable. This mechanism operates quietly, almost invisibly, but it explains why suffering can become strangely persistent in a person's life. Not because they consciously seek pain, but because their internal world has been organized around it. And once suffering becomes familiar enough, it begins to feel like home. But this mechanism has consequences. Because when someone unconsciously recreates the same painful patterns long enough, those patterns begin shaping the entire structure of their life. Relationships deteriorate. Opportunities collapse. Identity becomes tied to struggle. And slowly, without realizing it, the person becomes trapped inside the very pattern they once believed was simply bad luck. And this is where the shadow side of suffering begins to reveal itself. Because repeating these cycles does not only create pain, over time, it quietly destroys the life that could have existed outside them. At first, these patterns seem manageable. A difficult relationship, a stressful job, a few repeated mistakes. Most people assume these things are temporary, part of life, and sometimes they are. But when the same emotional structure quietly repeats itself year after year, something else begins to happen. The pattern stops being a phase. It becomes a lifestyle. You can see it in the man who has spent 20 years complaining about the same frustrations. Every conversation circles back to the same disappointments. The boss who never respected him. The opportunities that never appeared. The people who never appreciated what he had to offer. At first, his friends listened with sympathy, then curiosity. Eventually, something else begins to appear. A quiet realization that the story never changes. Years pass. Different workplaces. Different colleagues. But somehow, the same outcome keeps appearing. Another situation where he feels overlooked. Another explanation for why life never quite worked out. Another confirmation that the world has treated him unfairly. And slowly, without anyone saying it directly, the uncomfortable thought begins to form. Maybe the world isn't the only factor here. You see a similar pattern in relationships. Someone who repeatedly finds themselves in emotional chaos. At the beginning of every relationship, they are hopeful. They believe they have finally found someone different. But gradually, the dynamic shifts. Arguments appear. Misunderstandings grow. Emotional distance spreads through the relationship like a quiet fog. And eventually, the relationship collapses. The person feels wounded again, disappointed again, certain that they simply have terrible luck with partners. But the cycle does not stop, because the deeper pattern remains untouched. Carl Jung once wrote something that feels almost uncomfortable when you first hear it. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. What Jung meant was this: sometimes it is easier to keep repeating painful situations than to confront the psychological patterns creating them. because confronting those patterns threatens the story a person has built about their life. And that story often contains something very powerful: justification. If the world is unfair, then failure has an explanation. If relationships always collapse because of the other person, then the individual never has to examine their own role in the dynamic. If suffering is always caused by external circumstances, then the deeper psychological work never becomes necessary. But this kind of unconscious protection comes with a cost. Because while the mind protects the identity, life quietly moves forward. Years pass, opportunities close, friendships drift away, and the person begins to notice something unsettling. Their life looks very similar to how it did 10 years ago, maybe even 20. The same frustrations, the same disappointments, the same explanations. At some point, the suffering stops feeling dramatic. It becomes ordinary, predictable, almost dull. And this is perhaps the most dangerous stage of all. Because once suffering becomes normal, people stop questioning it. They assume this is simply how life works. This is how relationships are. This is what careers feel like. This is what adulthood becomes. But the deeper tragedy is not the suffering itself. It is the life that slowly disappears while the person remains trapped inside the pattern. The relationships that could have existed, the risks that were never taken, the identities that were never explored, all quietly sacrificed to maintain a familiar psychological structure. And by the time many people begin to sense something is wrong, the pattern has already shaped most of their adult life. Which raises an even more important question. If these cycles of suffering are so destructive, why do they begin in the first place? Why does the psyche build identities around struggle? Why does emotional pain become so deeply familiar? To answer that, we have to go further back to the earliest emotional environments where these patterns quietly take root. Because long before these cycles appear in careers, relationships, or identity, they usually begin somewhere much earlier. Somewhere most people rarely think to look. To understand why suffering becomes so familiar, you usually have to go back much earlier than most people expect. Long before careers, long before adult relationships, long before the person even has the language to describe what they feel. It often begins in childhood, not always through dramatic trauma. Sometimes the origins are much quieter than that. A household where love existed, but emotional understanding did not. A parent who provided everything materially, but remained emotionally distant. A family where feelings were ignored, dismissed, or treated as weakness. Or the opposite, a home filled with tension, unpredictable moods, arguments that appeared without warning, moments where the emotional atmosphere could shift suddenly from calm to hostile. For a child, these environments create powerful internal lessons. The child is not analyzing the situation consciously. They are absorbing it, recording it, learning what connection feels like, learning what safety feels like, and learning what love feels like. If love is mixed with tension, the nervous system begins linking the two. If attention only appears during conflict, conflict becomes associated with connection. If emotional validation is rare, the child learns to survive by adapting to emotional instability. These patterns form what psychologists sometimes call attachment styles, internal models of how relationships operate, models that continue guiding behavior long after childhood ends. A child who grows up with consistent warmth often develops a sense that relationships can be stable, predictable, safe. But a child raised around emotional unpredictability may develop a very different internal map. They may unconsciously expect distance, or rejection, or conflict. not because they want these things, but because their early environment taught them that this is what connection looks like. And the mind, especially in childhood, has one primary goal: adaptation. The child learns to survive emotionally inside the world they are given. They become sensitive to certain signals. They anticipate certain outcomes. They shape their personality around the environment that surrounds them. And once these patterns are internalized, they rarely disappear on their own. Instead, they quietly follow the person into adulthood. This is why someone raised around emotional distance may repeatedly feel drawn to distant partners. Why someone who grew up around chaos may feel strangely uncomfortable in calm relationships. Why someone who only received attention during moments of struggle may unconsciously recreate situations where they need help, rescue, or validation. The psyche is not intentionally seeking suffering. It is seeking familiarity. Carl Jung believed that much of adult life is shaped by unconscious material formed in early experience. Memories, emotions, expectations that remain active beneath conscious awareness. These unconscious structures influence the people we feel drawn to, the environments we feel comfortable inside, even the risks we believe we are capable of taking. Without realizing it, the adult personality often becomes an extension of the child's emotional survival strategies. What once helped the child adapt eventually begins limiting the adult. But this realization can be uncomfortable because it challenges a belief most people prefer to keep: the belief that their life is simply the result of external circumstances. Recognizing these early psychological structures introduces a much more complicated truth. Some of the patterns shaping your life today were written long before you had any control over them, but they continue operating long after you do. Which leads to an important moment in psychological development. The moment when a person begins to see the pattern clearly, to recognize the emotional scripts they have been unconsciously following, and to face a difficult realization. The past may have written the original blueprint, but continuing to follow it is no longer something life is forcing them to do. And this is where a new kind of psychological responsibility begins. Not the kind promoted by motivational slogans, but something much quieter, something more mature. The slow process of becoming conscious of the patterns that once operated automatically. At some point in a person's life, a quiet moment of recognition appears. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a small, uncomfortable realization. The same argument keeps appearing in different relationships. The same frustration follows them from one job to another. The same emotional reactions surface in situations that seem unrelated. At first, it feels like coincidence. Then a pattern begins to emerge. And eventually, a thought appears that most people spend years trying to avoid. What if the problem is not only out there? What if part of the pattern is inside me? This moment is psychologically significant because it marks the beginning of what Carl Jung called individuation, the process of becoming conscious of the unconscious forces shaping one's life. Before this moment, life feels like something that happens to a person. Circumstances appear. People behave in certain ways. Events unfold, and the individual reacts. But once awareness begins to grow, something changes. The person starts noticing the emotional reflexes they previously took for granted, the defensive reactions, the familiar narratives, the expectations they carry quietly into every new situation. And slowly, a deeper understanding begins to form. The mind has been repeating patterns that once served a purpose, patterns designed to survive certain environments. But those environments may no longer exist. The emotional blueprint, however, remains active. This recognition does not immediately dissolve the pattern. Awareness alone rarely does. But it creates something essential: distance. The individual begins observing their reactions instead of being completely absorbed by them. They notice when they feel drawn to familiar emotional dynamics. They notice when old expectations begin shaping how they interpret a situation. And this awareness introduces a new possibility: choice. Not the dramatic idea of reinventing one's entire personality overnight. Psychological integration rarely works that way. Instead, it begins with small acts of recognition. A moment where someone pauses before reacting in the usual way. A moment where they question a familiar story about themselves. A moment where they notice the emotional gravity pulling them back toward old patterns. Friedrich Nietzsche once described maturity in a way that fits this process well. He suggested that becoming who you are requires confronting the parts of yourself that were formed unconsciously. Not rejecting them, but understanding them. The goal is not to erase the past or pretend early experiences never shaped the psyche. The goal is to become conscious of them, because once unconscious patterns become visible, they lose some of their control. The person begins responding differently. They may choose partners who feel unfamiliar not because something is wrong, but because the relationship lacks the chaos they once expected. They may remain in calm situations long enough for the nervous system to adjust to stability. They may recognize the urge to sabotage progress and pause before acting on it. These changes rarely feel comfortable at first. Familiar suffering has a strange emotional gravity. Stepping outside it can feel disorienting. But over time, the psyche begins forming new emotional associations. Stability becomes less foreign. Peace becomes less threatening. And slowly, the identity once built around suffering begins to loosen. Not through force, but through awareness. And this is where a deeper form of freedom begins. Not the freedom of escaping difficulty, but the freedom of no longer being unconsciously organized around it. If you observe human lives long enough, you begin to notice something strange. Most people are not only shaped by their suffering, they become organized around it. The disappointments, the conflicts, the quiet stories they repeat about themselves. Over time, these experiences stop being temporary events. They become identity. Someone is the one who was betrayed, the one who never gets recognized, the one who always ends up in difficult relationships, the one who somehow never quite finds stability. And once these identities settle into place, the mind begins interpreting life through them. New experiences are filtered through old expectations. Small setbacks feel like confirmation. Moments of peace feel temporary, almost suspicious, because they do not fit the emotional pattern the psyche has learned to expect. This is why suffering can quietly repeat itself for years, not because life demands it, but because the mind has grown accustomed to it. Carl Jung once wrote something that reveals the core of this dynamic. People do not have ideas. Ideas have people. The same could be said about psychological patterns. People do not simply carry them. Often, the patterns carry the person. They guide perception. They shape decisions. They determine what feels possible. And most of the time, the individual remains unaware that the pattern is even there. They call it fate, bad luck, the kind of life they were given. But occasionally, something interrupts the cycle. Not a dramatic event, not a sudden transformation, just a moment of quiet recognition. The moment someone begins noticing the pattern instead of living inside it, they recognize the familiar emotional reactions, the familiar choices, the familiar explanations they have repeated for years. And for the first time, they see the structure behind them. That moment does not instantly change a life. Most patterns are deeply rooted. They have been practiced for years, sometimes decades. But awareness introduces something that suffering alone never could: perspective. The person begins to see that the pattern exists. And once something can be seen clearly, it becomes harder to believe that it is destiny. Some people continue repeating the cycle. Familiar suffering can be strangely comfortable. It explains the past. It protects identity. It avoids the uncertainty that comes with change. But others begin doing something different. They pause. They question the emotional gravity pulling them toward the same outcomes. They notice the old patterns appearing and choose not to follow them. Not perfectly, not all at once, but gradually. And sometimes that quiet shift is where an entirely different life begins. Not because suffering disappears, but because it no longer defines the person who experiences it.